Welcome to the Anomalous Review, the official podcast of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, or SCU. I'm Michael Glosson. I'm a philosopher of science and technology, a contributing member of SCU, and the host of the show. At SCU, we work together to push forward the serious technical study of anomalous phenomena, and as part of that mission, this show hosts in-depth conversations with professionals who are applying their expertise to the study of phenomena that are well evidenced but not yet well understood. We're glad to have you listen along, and if you enjoy these conversations, please take a minute to like and subscribe. It really will help us keep this project going. One of the biggest challenges when studying this subject is sorting fact from fiction, rigorous theorizing from wild speculation, reliable information from obfuscation, sometimes intentional obfuscation. As if reality wasn't complex enough. In a recent conversation I had outside this show with the philosopher Stephen Brown, he made a fascinating point. He said, when it comes to some subjects, there's no option not to be a conspiracy theorist. Let me tell you what he meant by that and why I think it's so interesting. For instance, when studying the Roswell event, there are really only two possible theories of the case. Either A, a balloon carrying a high-altitude instrument used by the Army's Project Mogul for detecting Soviet nuclear tests crashed in the desert, and then a small group of government officials conspired to cover up the truth by convincing the world that it was just a weather balloon. That conspiracy then came to light, and everybody has the story now. Or B, something otherworldly crashed in the desert, and a small group of government officials conspired to cover up the truth by convincing the world that it was a weather balloon, and then, when that story was deemed implausible, another later group of government officials conspired to convince the world that it was an instrument from Project Mogul that had crashed. So either we believe that there was a conspiracy pulled off by the government to cover up the Project Mogul crash by convincing the public that it was a weather balloon, or we believe that there was a meta-conspiracy pulled off by the government to cover up a UFO crash by convincing us it was a Project Mogul crash. Either way, our theory of the case is, in some sense, a conspiracy theory. I think this is a brilliant observation. How then do we go about excavating the facts and reconstructing the truth when they've been buried, sometimes intentionally, beneath layers of misinformation, obfuscation, fabrication, and conjecture? What sources do you trust to guide you between competing narratives? How much faith do you put in your intuitions when they have in some ways already been shaped by the narratives that you're now trying to evaluate? It's a problem. My guest today, Garrett Graff, isn't new to subjects plagued by muddied facts and wild speculation, though. In fact, he's one of a small handful of respected journalists who seems to continually gravitate towards subjects that are fraught with the gnarly uncertainties that might make others shrink. His book on 9/11 debuted at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. His book on Watergate was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's taught journalism at Georgetown University, and he's currently a columnist for the Washington Post. Today, we're discussing the challenges he faced when researching and writing his 2023 book, UFO, the inside story of the U.S. government's search for alien life here and out there. I like this book very much. It puts forward an interesting thesis that isn't articulated as clearly anywhere else, and although there are points where I want to challenge the trust he places in or the conclusions he draws about certain claims or source materials, I think it's important that everybody who's interested in this subject understands the arguments that he makes. That central argument is that the history of the UFO subject is the history of a conspiracy by the government to cover something up. But it might not be knowledge that it's covering up. It might be ignorance. Here now is my conversation with Garrett Graff. Welcome to the Anomalous Review. My guest today is Garrett Graff. Garrett, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've written a lot of books, a lot of very interesting books. And one of the things that I tried to do when I was doing background research on you is figure out what's the thread among all of them and how a UFO book fits into it. So you've written on JFK, Watergate, 9/11, cyber terrorism, UFOs, and then your most recent book is on D-Day. How does the UFO subject fit into all of that?
So you're right. It at a first glance seems anomalous, a word that comes up a lot in our conversation. But I come at the UFO story as a national security story. And to me, I am not a lifelong ufologist. I am not someone who, has been fascinated with the subject for decades. I'm not someone who grew up devouring, science fiction and Star Trek, or, whatever your sort of favorite UFO adjacent popular culture things are.
Star Trek,
Um,
pretty much it. Yeah.
yeah. But what got me interested in this story was the sense that the interest in the story was changing in national security circles, and that the people um, that I was spending time around in Washington, in the intelligence community, in the military community, in the law enforcement community, on Capitol Hill, in government, um, were talking about this subject differently. And, you know, uh, you began to see post 2017, for reasons that sort of anyone who is listening to this podcast would know.
Yeah, the Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal article.
Yeah, and the follow-up reporting that they did and that Politico did, and the congressional interest and mandates in the NDAA to spur UAP work at the director of national intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. You began to hear serious people talking seriously about this subject in a way that felt new and distinct to me. And I talk about it in the book that there was sort of this one specific moment that crystallized my interest in this as a book topic, which was in December 2020. John Brennan gave an interview to a DC journalist named Tyler Cowen, and he was asked about UFOs. John Brennan, of course, in 2020 was a career intelligence officer, had spent the better part of a decade at that point atop the U.S. intelligence community as White House Homeland Security advisor and CIA director. And he was asked about UFOs, and he gave this answer, which I will quote because of precisely how torturous the syntax of it is. Some of the phenomenon we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might in fact be some type of phenomenon that is the result of something that we don't yet understand and that could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life. And that struck me as just a really, really weird thing for someone like John Brennan to say. John Brennan's a very serious guy. I have covered him. I have interviewed him. I knew a lot of people who had worked with him. I'd actually traveled with John Brennan at one point when he was CIA director, when I was working on an article for Wired magazine about the director of national intelligence, Jim Clapper. And, for Brennan to walk out of the jobs that he had had and to say, in effect, like, I'm really puzzled by this UFO thing, felt like a real important signal to me. In my book talks, I talk about, there just aren't that many puzzles in your life if you are CIA director.
Yeah.
If you have spent 8 years atop the CIA and the White House Homeland Security advisor role, you wake up any morning and you say, I want to know what kind of pants Michael wore last Tuesday. The U.S. has an $80 billion a year intelligence apparatus that goes out and answers that question. And we have satellites, and we have sensors, and we have signals intelligence intercept networks, and we have covert operators, and we have agents, what you would sort of commonly call spies. There are intelligence officers, there are intelligence analysts. There are 17 different intelligence agencies with different specialties that sort of play different roles, to go out and answer those puzzles. And so for the CIA director to walk out of that job and say, basically, like, man, this UFO thing's real weird, isn't it? Sort of just felt like it was worth diving into. And so I got interested in it in the context of that national security conversation. And I got interested in the particular slice that I bit off because, that slice, the US government's involvement in the hunt for UFOs and alien life, actually is very consistent with the type of work that I have done in terms of writing histories of the Cold War and Watergate and the presidency and 9/11 and, nuclear weapons. And so, I think the story that I tried to, part of what is complicated about the UFO story, and we can get into this later, is there are just a lot of different parts of it, and a lot of different facets. And in some ways, I think one of the things that I come away from my work and research on this is thinking that probably our conversation about UFOs as we have it at the sort of popular level in our society and culture, entangles a bunch of things that are probably actually unrelated to one another. And, that sort of the question of UFOs here is probably unrelated to the questions about alien life out across the rest of the universe, and potentially unrelated to the questions of, what we would commonly call alien abductions or experiences. And that, those might be three entirely separate phenomenon or objects or experiences, that we sort of all lump together as UFOs, or aliens or flying saucers, in a way that's not actually reflective of what the final answers will end up being.
I love that John Brennan quote as an entry point into the subject, because John Brennan first knows how to put a sentence together. I mean, he's not an incompetent speaker. But to hear somebody, I shared that intuition with you, but to hear somebody in his position just garble out an answer with like, so I want to graph that statement in some way and show like how many parentheticals and like hedging phrases there are in it. But it's yeah, a little bit disconcerting that somebody in his position is so mystified by this. But it seems so I see how you as a national security writer heard that and thought fascinating. I need to jump on that. But I see this other kind of thread through your work where it seems like you like topics that have that attract kind of conspiratorial thinking and
Mm-hmm.
weird outside, groups that have their own sort of weird agendas and views. But you tend to take this approach to those topics that says you don't just defend kind of the official story. Is I think that's kind of a concept I work a lot in my head with, is there's like an official story. You don't just defend that, but you definitely don't say, well, the conspiracy theorists are right. You tend to kind of approach these subjects and say there really is something fascinating here. It's just not what the conspiracy people think is
Yes.
so fascinating about it. And then you write that and you sort of reframe it. So you're really good at applying a new sort of insightful framework to these topics. And that means that for the topic of UAP, you must have heard these people in the national security sector talking kind of a new way or giving new credence to it, but thought that there's something more than just the pure national security framework that needs to be applied to this subject. And what is that? If it's not, I mean, you definitely don't come down on the side that like it was just aliens, But
Right.
so what was like the inkling? I know maybe you don't have a firm conclusion, but what in your head said there's probably something more than just Chinese balloons and conspiracy theories to this.
Yeah. that's a really insightful observation and really insightful question that actually no one has ever put together in exactly that way, and I really appreciate it because it gets at the core of what I see as a writer as one of the like things that I most try to do for uh, readers, or actually in any of the reporting and historical work that I do, which is, you know, in a city like Washington, I think we are way over rotated on covering politics
Mm.
and way under invested in covering government.
Mm.
And that like the whole world would be better if we took 1,000 reporters off of the White House and Capitol Hill beat and instead better covered all of the little agencies and jobs and cabinet departments that where the actual sort of like money and work takes place in Washington. And it was something that I was always attracted to as a magazine writer, which is um, in 2014, 2015, I wrote a couple of really big magazine articles about the corruption within the Border Patrol. And, the Border Patrol is this massive agency. It is the largest federal law enforcement agency in the country. It is larger than the NYPD. It is, larger than the U.S. Coast Guard. It is, and there are like 3 people in the country who cover it full time as reporters. And that's true sort of across all of DHS also. DHS is this 250,000 employee organization with operational components that include the TSA and the Coast Guard and the Secret Service and the Border Patrol and immigrations and customs enforcement. And like there just aren't that many people who cover that in a dedicated way. And in fact, most reporters in Washington who cover Homeland Security sort of get it lumped together with the Department of Justice, which is its own massive agency, a massive cabinet department. And so for me, what I've always been interested in is diving into the like nuts and bolts of government and understanding how bureaucracies work and the incentive structures that get us to the point of country that we have today. Like most of the corruption of the Border Patrol stems from this incredibly small issue that they are basically in U.S. government job description parlance. The Border Patrol are police officers and not detectives, and they are agents as opposed to special agents in government parlance, which meant that the Border Patrol did not have the authority for most of its existence in post 9/11 to investigate its own corruption and malfeasance, and had to rely on other agencies like the FBI or ICE or the Inspector General's office to investigate its own internal corruption. It was like running the nation's largest police force with no internal affairs unit.
Just because of
And
that designation.
just because of that little designation. And like that enabled it to become the most corrupt and violent law enforcement agency in the country, honestly. And so for me, diving into a story like UFOs and the U.S. government's involvement, or my earlier book Raven Rock, which is the sort of story of the U.S. government's Cold War Doomsday plan, sort of all of the weird things that would happen during and after a nuclear attack, it is this chance to try to basically like tell taxpayers what they're getting for their money, and as you said, I write a lot on sort of conspiracy adjacent topics, but I'm not actually myself a conspiracist, in part because the joke that I always have, which is, mostly pejorative, is my problem with government conspiracy theories is that they presuppose a level of competence, foresight, and planning that is just not on display in the rest of the work that the government does. And so, let's look at the UFO conspiracy, where, it's not that I don't believe that the government would cover up alien crashes and alien bodies. It's that I don't think the government could keep that secret for any meaningful length of time. And, sure, maybe if an alien craft crashed, this week, they would be able to keep it secret for a couple of hours, a couple of days, maybe a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two. But like the government's just actually not that good at keeping really big secrets. And when you sort of look at the way that the government keeps secrets, it can keep small secrets for a long period of time, or big secrets for a short period of time. Let's look at my most recent book, D-Day. In 1944, the biggest secret in the Allied war effort was the timing and the location of the D-Day invasion. That was a secret they had to keep for 6 months, basically from January 44 through June 6th, 1944. It was the only two secrets that Operation Overlord really cared about. There are at least a half dozen examples in those 6 months of that secret being compromised. Entirely accidentally. There's a colonel who gets, a general who gets drunk at a cocktail party and starts talking about it. And Eisenhower, ends up busting him back to being a colonel and, basically deporting him back to the United States. There's a set of Overlord war plans that one planner accidentally mails back to his mom in Chicago because, he had on his desk, one envelope that was going to his mom and one that was going into interoffice mail, and, put the war plans in the wrong envelope, and, it went back to his mom in Chicago.
Happens all the time, right?
It is, there's a officer who leaves his briefcase of war plans on a double-decker bus in London by accident, when he sort of does that thing that we have all done on public transit, where he sort of like suddenly realizes at the last minute that the bus is at his stop, and he jumps up and runs off the bus and realizes that he's left his briefcase full of war plans on the bus as the bus is, pulling away from him. So, these secrets get compromised in lots of weird little dumb
sort of Groucho Marxian ways, right?
Yes, that are, again, like in the best of circumstances with the best of intentions, and that's leaving aside the possibility of, anyone like Edward Snowdening, the UFO conspiracy. And let me give you sort of two other examples of this. Um, I think people just really underestimate how much paperwork hiding alien spacecraft would entail in the U.S. government. David Grush, familiar to anyone listening to this podcast, in some of his interviews in the last year, has talked about that he believes that there are 5,000 people in the U.S. government, read into or with knowledge of the UAP, UFO, alien cover-up. Do you have any idea how much paperwork 5,000 people in the U.S. government generate in the course of a year? Um, Budget briefings, personnel memos, performance evaluations, requisition contracts for supplies. Even before you get to the PowerPoint that's like, here's the cave where we've hidden where we've hidden this week's alien craft. And just like the idea that there are, 5,000 people in government and we have, never had one of them accidentally, attach one of those PowerPoints to a roommate's email, or, accidentally left one of those on the printer in, the break room, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. Just like boggles my mind, because again, when you approach these stories as like government bureaucracy stories, they just look really different. And you hold up sort of the idea that we've had this 80-year conspiracy of crashes at Roswell that we've kept secret, with the reality of like the Discord leaks last year, where the most important tactical secret in the US government right now is our understanding of Ukraine's ability to fight. That is the most important day-to-day secret that the US government is keeping, because, it's knowledge that Russia is desperate for. It's knowledge that it would expose to our allies our own penetration of Ukraine's intelligence and military services. Who inside the Ukrainian government is cooperating with our intelligence agencies, against Ukraine's own interests. Like, this is the type of stuff that like people would, be sent to jail or executed if it comes out. And it turns out we were not able to keep PowerPoints about Ukraine's ability to fight that were being given to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs at the highest level of the government from being read and accessed and printed out by a junior Massachusetts Air National Guardsman who was photographing those documents and posting them to a video game Discord server for a year before the U.S. government and intelligence and law enforcement caught on. And like, I just can't square sort of like that level of bureaucratic incompetence with the idea that the government has some massive UFO cover-up that it has been carrying on for 80 years.
That's that's a remarkable sort of lay of how you see the landscape of bureaucracy and how it functions, especially with regard to secrets. But there are certain points that sort of confuse me, because I'm not sure if the example you give works in one direction or the other. So, for instance, with the Air National Guardsman who had leaked a bunch of secrets on Discord for a year, we couldn't prevent him from doing that. But it also took a year for anybody to realize that it had happened, right? So, on the one hand, it's like, okay, the secrets get out, but they don't get out in the effective sort of way that where everybody immediately knows the secret either. So it seems like the U.S. government is at least competent enough to keep certain secrets if it wants to. Like nobody seems to really know what the design or functionality of the helicopter that was used to ferry people to kill Osama bin Laden or
Right.
whatever. We have a stealth helicopter. It's been like a decade. There's some speculations about like that it was a kit that was used to modify an Apache or something, but nobody really knows, and nobody's been able to figure out for a long
Yeah.
time. They could keep that. Do you think it's that certain types of secrets are more prone to be leaked or sort of harder to contain and others aren't? For instance, secrets that you might be able to just hand over to private industry, right? I mean, maybe the US government is really bad at keeping it secrets, or maybe Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman isn't so bad at it. Or do you think that that's not really one way or the other?
Yeah. I think that the again, the U.S. government is absolutely capable of keeping secrets. Um, what it struggles to do is keep secrets for a long period of time that involve a sort of larger community.
Hmm.
Um,
Those
and
5,000 people that Grush talks about.
well, yes, 5,000 people working on it now.
Hmm.
So, so what does that mean over 80 years? Is that, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 people who have gone through that program over, 80 years? Um, uh, that just feels like too many to me to have not had more concrete details of the program leak out.
Mhm.
That what and some of this gets also at part of what I think is so fascinating about the government's, quote unquote involvement with UFOs, which is it is very clear that there are a consistent set of programs that the going back at least to the 1980s, and possibly before, that people who are involved in these circles in the military and intelligence community, who are knowledgeable, who have security clearances, um, that look to them as sort of secondhand observers, like they are programs involving UFOs and aliens. Um, and and that to me, there was this Arrow report that came out at the beginning of the year that basically said, you know, we've looked at all of the we have located all of the programs that David Grush and other whistleblowers have pointed us to as being, the UFO cover up. I'm being somewhat
Sure.
hyperbolistic and pejorative in this. Um, but, and we have determined that all of those programs exist and are not about UFOs. And I think that there was sort of this like big ho hum reaction to that report where you had sort of all of the true believers say, this is more of the government covering up the cover up. And all of the people who were inclined to be total skeptics say, see, this was all a bunch of hoo-ha and nonsense. And to me, there was actually an incredibly fascinating answer buried in that Arrow report that I don't think people paid sufficient attention to, which is, okay, so what are these secret programs that the government has confirmed exist that look like to the people who work down the hall from them that they are about UFOs, but we now know aren't? And you can sort of think about what those categories of things could be, and they could be like just as fascinating and explosive as aliens, even if the answer isn't aliens. I mean, so what is this is are there propulsion systems that the US government has figured out that have not been made public yet? Is there engineering advances that our adversaries like Russia and China have made that we are trying to reverse engineer that we have not been able to figure out yet? Sort of technological breakthroughs that, Russia and China have achieved that we have not? Are there, investigations into or scientific research into states of matter
Mhm.
that are at the cutting edge of classified science right now that the government has sort of figured out or is in the process of trying to figure out that we have not actually ever made public? To me, one of the things that I sort of say is like, I think if you part of the challenge of this world is it is only ever the only two people who ever engage in the debate are total true believers or total skeptics. And sort of both of them show up at this conversation with a sort of all-encompassing worldview where everything either sort of reinforces or underscores the way that they come at this as a believer or a skeptic.
So there's no real conversation. It's just every piece of data fits perfectly.
Right. And that, to me, I think if you approach this subject with a completely open mind, you have to admit that there's something here that we don't understand. And that the answer to what that is could be a wide range of different things. From, parallel dimensions to time travel to, aliens
Whatever.
to
New physics
whoever.
could be anything.
Right, to physics that we don't yet understand. um and that in some ways, like, to me, um what I say about this is that aliens in some ways represent the least interesting answer
I agree. Yeah.
to what UAPs could unravel as in the decades ahead. And that's where, you get into, if you come at the Arrow report as the true believer or the total skeptic, like, you're going to read the Arrow report as what it is and how it fits into those two worldviews. If you come at
Could be
it
lots of things that we're just all
right,
kind of drawing one circle around and saying it all, it's all
right.
the same.
If you come at it as someone who, like, just is really open about the possibility of what this could be, like, that Arrow report is, has potential, hints at potential, that could be like real revolutions.
So I totally agree, especially when you say that aliens would be the least interesting of all of the answers. At least the sort of Independence Day aliens, if that's the case, I'm just really disappointed. But you want to kind of craft this middle road where you think that there is something interesting there. It's not just hoaxes. It's not just maybe visual, misapprehensions or something. But it's probably not the like Independence Day kind of Roswell cover up thing. But it seems like in some places you do just kind of hold up the official story given by some government office and say this is just kind of how this is what it really is. And I think a lot of readers of your book might just find it at certain points to be kind of an apology for or apologetic for
Hmm.
those views. For instance, I wanted to give you the chance to talk us through how you, as a journalist, look at those official accounts or the sort of plausible, Arrow or government office accounts, and assess their credibility or not. So, for instance, in several of your articles and in the book, you bring up the UFO flap of the like 1950s and 60s. And you point out that the CIA has explained that over 50% of UAP sightings through the 60s were due to the U-2 spy plane. I I find that explanation difficult to swallow. I don't know what the proper explanation is. I'm not convinced that there's aliens flying around in sort of better spaceships than ours. But I also find this explanation pretty implausible. I don't want to give the reasons up front, but I want to hear you say how you, when you look at that claim, how you assess it and say, okay, I'm going to go with this, when you know that the CIA and other government offices are prone to lie or cover up or sort of misdirect with their statements.
Yeah, and it's a totally fair question, and I think that I come at it as, you know, the vast majority of UFO sightings and UAP sightings are quotidian and boring. You know, we all know like a sizable, significant percentage of UFO sightings are the planet Venus.
Yeah, or the
You know,
moon, or yeah,
today, go on Twitter on any given day, and Starlink satellites appear to account for a sizable percentage of modern UFO sightings, UAP sightings. I just in terms of nomenclature, I think that the embrace of UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomenon, is incredibly important in the development of this story. For colloquial conversation purposes, I use them pretty interchangeably between UFOs and UAPs. But for reasons that we can talk about, or you may have already covered on the podcast, I actually think the sort of governmental embrace of UAP is actually a really important step forward in being open-minded about what these things could be. So, so from there, though, I think you pretty quickly shrink your pool of UFO UAP sightings that are worth paying attention to an incredibly small number. And, I don't know whether that number is in the, dozens, scores, hundreds, over these last 80 years. But like the cases that are really interesting and puzzling to me are pretty small in number. And they are cases like in the 1960s, Lonnie Zamora in Socorro, New Mexico. Small town police officer in New Mexico chasing a speeder on his way out of town, hears what he thinks is an explosion off in the desert, sees what he thinks is an overturned car off in the desert, abandons his chase, and, sort of starts bumping up and down on the road, or on the desert over to this thing. It gets closer, or he gets closer. He can see. I'm telling the short version of
sure,
this
yeah.
story. It's more detailed, and there's
I
more
think a lot of our
documentation
listeners
of it.
probably know the case semi well,
Um,
but yeah,
yeah.
overview.
Sees sort of two figures outside of it. It's white football shaped object. Figures disappear inside of it, and the thing takes off into the sky. Now, something happened to Lonnie Zamora in the desert that day. There's a New Mexico state trooper that shows up a few minutes later, sort of arrives on scene, sees him visibly traumatized by this experience, the FBI investigates, the military investigates, Project Blue Book shows up with, J. Allen Hynek. Um, and, there's some circumstantial physical evidence of something being there in the desert.
Like
You
prints on the
know,
ground or something, right?
yeah. And, Lonnie Zamora to me is like this unique type of witness that we have that stands apart in sort of the annals of ufology to me, who are these like credible witnesses who have sort of no apparent reason to have made up the story that they have made up. And actually, to the opposite, have a great deal of professional or personal pressure to not be the weirdo who reports a UFO sighting, who have sort of the one weird experience and then go back and lead the rest of their lives in obscurity. Like
He was
they're,
just a cop for the rest of his life, I think.
yeah, he just, next day, Lonnie Zamora wakes up and is, a cop in small town New Mexico. He never tries to monetize this. He never tries to, um, make it, sell a memoir out of it or make a movie out of it. And he's not one of these people, of which there are lots in the annals of ufology, who sort of become, again, pejoratively, the witnesses who are like, and then the aliens came by every Thursday afternoon for tea for the next, 20 years of my life. And, something happened to Lonnie. We can't explain it. And it continues to puzzle us, 60, 70 years later. Now, again, there are some super obvious answers that this could be. He was adjacent to the White Sands Proving Grounds. It's the height of the space race. Maybe he stumbled across, the military testing some Apollo moon lander in the desert. But, we've had 70 years go by and there's no evidence that has ever emerged from the government archives that the U.S. ever built a craft anything like the thing that he says that he saw. Fast forward, to today, I would put the Navy aviators of the last 20 years, the Tic Tac, the Gimbal, the Go Fast, Navy fighter pilots, in that same category, which is, highly credible witnesses who have no obvious reason to come forward with the sighting and encounter that they had. And in fact, quite the opposite, have a lot of professional pressure leaning against them coming forward. No one wants to be the Navy fighter pilot who lands back on the carrier and is like, you would not believe the dogfight I just had with a flying saucer.
Yeah.
Like that's a quick ticket to like being a washed out, has been back on shore somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
They're backed up by, some level of, instrument, instrument evidence, video, radar, FLIR sensors, sort of, et cetera, et cetera. And like, I put them in this sort of same really credible category, which is, again, I don't think that there are necessarily like hundreds of people like that over the last 80 years, but there are enough of them that I come away from this saying, we should be more interested in this when we are,
That's so
or than we
interesting
are.
because I get the sense from working in SCU that there are thousands of such cases, and maybe the difference between our perspectives is simply this factual question over how many there are. I mean, I wish Robert Powell or Rich Hoffman were here because they're much better with numbers and statistics than I am. But at what point would your mind change? Like, how many cases would you need in order to I don't know, have a sort of shift in your thinking about what would the shift even be? I mean, if there were thousands of more of those cases, it wouldn't be evidence that they were aliens or anything.
Right, and I don't think the distinction that I'm trying to draw is not um, is not in terms of quantity. Like this is if you say that you think that there are thousands who meet that, sure, for the sake of
Yeah, just for the sake of,
conversation,
yeah,
maybe thousands. But I think to me there's a distinction that take whatever the number is, you know, 99% of all UFO sightings, I think, are easily explainable and not that
oh
interesting.
yeah, sure, and nobody over here disagrees with that. Like
Yep,
we all agree. Yeah, when
yep.
we've all been subject to it. We've all looked up and been like, "What the hell is that?" Oh, there's four of them there in a line. It's a Starlink satellite. But for a
Yep.
minute, you're like, I don't.
And so I think that that's where the thing that the sort of distinction that I draw is more in there are enough Lonnie Zamora's and Navy aviators across this history that it makes me think there's something more here than nothing. And that we shouldn't rule out, that there's nothing interesting here.
Sure, absolutely.
And in fact, I think one of the things I come away from, and that I sort of say in my book talks about this, is the thing that frustrates me in this story as a taxpayer is I want the government to be more interested in this subject than it appears to be. That like if there are Navy pilots coming back to the carrier saying, I just encountered something that I can't explain, like, I want the Navy to care more about that than the Navy appears to care about that.
Yeah,
And that I think sort of part of and this, by the way, going back to a little bit of my aside earlier, is why I think the embrace of the unidentified anomalous phenomenon UAP rubric is so important to this conversation, because it opens up the world of possibility of what UFOs could be, and I think creates a permission structure for government entities and military personnel and intelligence community personnel to be interested in this subject seriously without feeling that they are going to risk their careers or security clearances.
absolutely. So I feel similarly, but it seems to me that a lot of the official statements that governments and government agencies make on this subject only have the effect of shutting down that possibility. And that's what frustrates me. Not that it's shutting down any particular thesis about what these things are, but that it seems to just collapse it and say there's nothing really there. So maybe you can tell me how you react to this imagined character, which is sort of me, but not entirely. So, like when the CIA says that 50% of UAP sightings through the 60s were due to the U-2 spy plane, my immediate that's the official story, and it seems to just shut down any contemplation about an interesting phenomenon that's there. Uh, but my immediate response is that it just seems flatly implausible that the U-2 was so easily detectable by civilian witnesses in America that it caused a continent spanning UAP flat for like 15 years, but it went totally undetected by the Russians for the entire time. I mean, if you look at where the U-2 was supposed to fly, it can't possibly account for 50% of the UAP sightings in America over that time. What about all the UAP sightings before 1955 when the U-2 didn't even fly? How does that account for those? When the U-2 stopped flying, why don't UAP sightings drop? With the altitude that it flies at, doesn't make any sense. You can't see. I'm just a spy plane, for God's sake. You're not supposed to be able to see it. Yet somehow America just went through a craze because of this thing. That seems like so flatly implausible to me that it doesn't seem even like a serious answer. You, however, seem to take it fairly seriously. What how did that calculation or assessment work out for you?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different things at work there that are worth untangling. One is, and I don't remember it off the top of my head here. I think that um, the the CIA assessment was, of some subset of, however you want to define it, like officially reported, um, uh, uh, officially reported sightings or credible sightings reported to Project Blue Book, or sort of some subset. I don't
Yeah,
think
one
that
of their
U2 was.
categories was air traffic controllers, but another was
Yep.
civilians who were calling into like Air Force bases and things.
Yep. So I don't think I would not interpret that as um 50% of the people who think that they saw a UFO during those 15 years saw a U2. That's not the way that I would interpret that. The second thing I think, and again, when we talk about this story, so much of this story to me is a bureaucracy story, and it's a story about bureaucracy incentives. Is um, I think at a really basic level, John Brennan is telling the truth.
I agree. Yeah,
And what I mean by that is the US government, that of the cover up within the US government is more about covering up what it doesn't know
ignorance. Yeah,
than what it does. And I think part of the challenge is from the outside, those look pretty similar,
hmm
which is, it looks like the, you know, Condon committee, shutting down any debate. It looks like, you know, decades of the Air Force, telling you not to worry about UFOs. Um,
I think that's because we have the assumption that the government covers up things because it knows exactly what it's hiding. That its
yes,
incentives are about like keeping something specific from you rather than keeping a sort of vacuum of its ignorance. But that's damaging too. If the government
yes,
lets everybody know that it doesn't understand something, that's a piece of intelligence for our adversaries. It's useful.
yes, and I think that that's and it also has to do with, so there's this bureaucratic incentive that the UFO story gets caught up in, which is like no one in the government, in the intelligence community, in the Pentagon is going to advance their career by being the person who says, man, we have no idea what this is.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want to be the briefer in the CIA saying to the CIA director, um, you would not believe the weird shit that we're seeing out there, that we just have absolutely no idea what it is. And you don't want to be the CIA director sitting in the Situation Room telling the president, Mr. President, you would not believe the weird things flying around in our airspace that we can't identify. That's just not the bureaucratic incentive structure. Um, and at the same time, the question of what the government does know about UFOs and UAPs and what it records and what it detects runs up against probably the one of the most sensitive other subjects that the government hates talking about, which is its own sensor capabilities.
Hmm.
And you know, uh, the government gets really squirrely talking about what it detects, where it detects, when it detects.
What resolution
Uh,
it could take pictures of
yeah,
and what frequencies. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't make sense.
and there's sort of good reason for that. Is like that is like the inner sanctum of inner sanctums of how how all of our various sensor networks and satellites operate. And the government has a lot of those systems. And we got sort of a little reminder of that last summer with that Titanic submersible, where if you remember, like, the whole world goes on this, emotional journey for 5 days, about, are these people alive? What's happened to them? Where did it go down? They find the wreckage. Everyone's dead. And the government says a couple of days later, there's a story in the Wall Street Journal that the Navy's, submarine defense
Acoustic sensor.
acoustic sensor system detected the implosion of the submersible in real time, and that the government knew from 1/8 of a millisecond later, that everyone was dead and that the thing had imploded. But the government sort of doesn't like talking about the ability of its acoustic anti-submarine network in the North Atlantic, and sort of tried to cover that up for a week or so. And those systems exist all around. I think one of the things that is hard to hard for us to, again, disentangle from the outside is, the government is going to sort of instinctually cover up what it is able to detect, which looks to the outsider like what the thing is,
Yeah.
but it would also cover up in the same way if it didn't know what the thing was.
And that's intentional, right? Because they don't, it should be indistinguishable from the outside whether you're covering up knowledge or ignorance. That way you can't tell from the style of cover up which one is being covered up. So it's a sort of, it does come back to sort of like bite itself, because then the public assumes that you're covering up because and you don't have any way of signaling to them that no, we're actually covering up this because we don't know what it is. But then if they did, you wouldn't know if they were telling you the truth or
Yep.
not, because you're caught in this bizarre sort of world of intelligence and messaging.
And that, again, is why I think that John Brennan quote is so interesting and important, which is, if you take that quote at face value, it actually tells us an enormous amount, that there's like something that the government has detected, that it has put some amount of resources into trying to solve, that it has not yet solved, and is super uncomfortable talking about how little it actually understands what the thing is or what the phenomenon is. Maybe it's not a thing, maybe it's a phenomenon, but like that, I think in some ways you look at things like these, the Arrow report or the Brennan quote, and people, try to find the hidden meaning in
Trying to
it.
decode it or something. Yeah, nothing to
When actually, like, if you just take it at face value, it is actually sort of just as illuminating and explosive and open to possibility as the thing would be if you'd actually bothered to decode it accurately.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know then that the government is prone, via its own incentive structure, rationally prone to obfuscate and cover up and hide and misdirect all sorts of things under certain circumstances, when it has to do with sensitive intelligence matters, or when it has to do with anything that if you knew it, you could then infer maybe something about their sensitive intelligence capabilities, or the intelligence that they had. So then it puts me in a weird position when I'm trying to read government statements and know how to interpret them. Am I interpreting it at face value, or should I interpret it in some different way? For instance, like when the Arrow reporter came out, it said that I'm trying to find the exact wording, but it says that uh, we found nothing that is evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. That seems to me like, at face value, I understand exactly what it means. And I don't want to seem like a conspiracist who's sort of decoding everything, but it does seem strange to me that that sort of statement gets made a lot. We have nothing that is evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, but that I know for a fact that among the scientists who work on this, there is no agreed upon standard for what constitutes evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence. So I know that there's no conceivable circumstance right now that they could say anything else. If they found a spaceship with hieroglyphs on it, I don't think that they could say we've concluded that this is an extraterrestrial intelligence, because they don't have those agreed upon standards. So how do I interpret that? Or like, how do I interpret, to give another example, the Roswell case? I have no fucking clue what happened at Roswell. Uh, but I know that the Project Mogul explanation, which I think that you tend to accept, that a balloon that was uh, a balloon system that was used to essentially listen for nuclear test explosions around the Earth, that thing crashed um, near Roswell, or the Air Force Base, Groom Lake, I guess. Uh, that seems semi-plausible, but there's other things that don't seem very plausible about it. Like, why? I mean, there was no more sensitive military base on the face of the planet at that time. I mean, the most important secret in America was whether that one um, flight crew had nuclear bombs or had nuclear capabilities, was right there. What are the chances that they were just testing, you know, balloon systems near that could fail, that are in their test fail phase? That seems unlikely, but it also seems very likely that if something strange did happen, we would get the exact story that we did. And I think you can probably agree with that. Like, if there were an extraterrestrial ship or whatever that crashed at Roswell and we didn't have a clue what it was, probably the United States government would have come up with a successive set of most plausible explanations using whatever information it could tell us at the time. Eventually, initially, it was just a weather balloon, and then later, when Project Mogul gets declassified, it becomes Project Mogul, and so on and so forth. So we would be in the exact same position as we are now. So, do you think that would you have written the exact same book if Roswell had been an alien crash? Wouldn't you be in the exact same position that you are now? Wouldn't you have gotten the same explanation from the government, and wouldn't you have taken it as prima facie plausible and written the same book? Or
Yeah.
how do you know?
So, to me, there's actually one very convincing piece of evidence that absolutely nothing interesting happened in Roswell in July 1947. And it has absolutely nothing to do with Roswell,
Okay.
which is the Fermi Paradox. This is probably the most famous conversation in extraterrestrial conversation
Buddy.
and
Yeah, whatever.
ufology and, et cetera, et cetera. And, it is Enrico Fermi's question, basically, where are they?
Where is
You know,
everyone?
it, if life is as common as we think it is in the universe, why don't we see a lot more of it? That conversation happens at Los Alamos National Lab in the summer of 1950. And we know that because what kicked off that conversation between Fermi and Edward Teller and another physicist is a cartoon in the New Yorker that ran that spring. So we can date the follow-up conversation to when the cartoon ran. And the thing that I think people miss is there is this, sort of assumption or theory or accepted fact in the Roswell conspiracies that the crashed bodies and spacecraft were flown across the country to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the wake of that July crash. again, think like a government bureaucracy. That spacecraft, if it had happened, if that had included recovered technology or bodies, no one would have bothered to fly it all the way across the country to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It would have been driven right up the road to Los Alamos National Lab. In Los Alamos in 1947, the US had already gathered all of the world's leading physicists and engineers in an isolated, highly secret, highly controlled environment where they were trying to answer the biggest, most important questions about physics. Why would you fly this crashed spacecraft and dead bodies to a government office building in Ohio filled with sort of mid-ranking company and field grade intelligence officers? You would have taken that question, you would have taken that recovered technology, that recovered craft, to the biggest and best minds that the US could deploy against it. They would have just driven the thing up the road on a truck to Los Alamos.
And that's the thing that seals it for you. Like,
well, so what seals it for me is if there were 10 people in the entire US government who had been asked to consult on a crashed alien spacecraft in 1947, I don't see how there's any way that Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller are not at least one of those 10.
Sure.
And so if in the summer of 1950, the two of them are sitting around saying, man, it's just so weird that we've never seen any evidence of any aliens, and we have that conversation so precisely dated because of the context, and that conversation is so famous because of the people who were around it, who were sitting there and remember it, and that they were talking amongst themselves. Like, this wasn't like Enrico Fermi goes out and gives some public address that's covered on ABC News and it, could be part of the elaborate cover-up. The
lunchroom
idea
conversation or whatever. Yeah.
The idea is, this is the two of them talking in the inner sanctum of the inner sanctum of all of the US government's secrets. And the two of them are sort of saying we've seen no evidence of aliens. Like, sure, like maybe that's part of some disinformation campaign, but like, I doubt it. And again, I just sort of take that conversation at face value. And to me, like, the idea that we're 3 years into some massive cover-up of alien technology and crashed alien bodies, and that Enrico Fermi and Edward Teller have never been asked to like look at the thing and try to figure out the physics of the propulsion system, just like doesn't hold water to me.
My ability to, I think that argument makes a lot of sense. My ability to imagine what the bureaucracy of like 1947 US government would do is I have very little confidence in my ability to do that. But I get the prima facie reasoning of it. And it seems like the Fermi paradox to you is like well, let me say this. I think some people will hear your answer to the question as evasive and say, well, let's not even go into the details of like whatever happened at Roswell, what details there are we don't are contestable anyway, because this larger consideration seems to just solve the answer to me. I don't think that's evasive, because I think what you're doing is a kind of reasoning that we call Bayesian reasoning, where you're like, you have a set of presuppositions about the world that kind of undergird your thinking. And one of those presuppositions is that the Fermi paradox, the fact that like we haven't encountered anybody, is a pretty good indication of the state of things, or the state of what we know. That if there were lots and lots of alien beings out there and civilizations, we'd probably have figured it out by now. Uh, that does seem right to you, that the fact that they're not apparent is a good indication that they're not here, or they haven't visited here, they don't know we're here or something.
Yes, but I also think there's almost nothing that we can extrapolate about whether they exist based on whether we found them in the last 80 years. Like, I think to me, this is where we just like totally misunderstand our place in the universe, which is, um, I think every piece of evidence that we have of advancing science in the last 30 years shows that the math is on the side of the aliens. And
Existing,
that, sorry?
existing, you mean?
Existing,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that actually life is probably quite common across the universe. Intelligent life is, some subset of life, but probably equally, equally teeming across the universe. Um, but that, when I talk about this, we'll leap right from the Fermi paradox to the next most famous piece of extraterrestrial science, and the Drake equation,
Mhm.
which is Frank Drake's sort of back of the envelope calculation of the likelihood of life around the rest of the universe. And it's a pretty it was a brilliant piece of work, but it's a pretty straightforward equation that, like, of what percentage of stars have planets, what percentage of those planets are habitable, what percentage of habitable planets develop life, what percentage of places where life develops develop into intelligent life. And then you get to what is actually the only variable that actually turns out to matter at all, which is L, which is the length of time an intelligent civilization lasts.
Mhm.
And L turns out to be the whole ball game when we talk about the universe, which is, if L is 10,000 years, even a million, couple million years, there could be all sorts of intelligent life that comes and goes. And we might be still effectively functionally alone right now. If L is, hundreds of millions or a billion years, yeah, there's probably actually a lot of life out there right now that, maybe we will find, maybe we won't. Um, but to me, the question of, where is everybody, sort of wrongly presupposes this like human centric view that, like, we are a particularly advanced civilization, A, and B, anyone would care that we exist. That, we just haven't been around that long. We haven't been looking for all that long. We haven't been looking in particularly sophisticated ways.
So what if we
And
flip it though? What if we say the question isn't about us finding them, but the question is, would we have been found by now? I mean, the Earth has been habitable for like 3.5 billion years. I mean, we've had an atmosphere that's giving off the right sort of frequencies, or reflecting the right sort of light frequencies that could be detected. The galaxy is about 100,000 light years across. That means for effectively 3.5 billion years, we've been visible to anybody in the galaxy who has the technology to look around clearly enough to see that we're here. So it seems almost certain to me that there's lots of life in the galaxy. Just, I mean, whatever L is, there's enough that even the outliers make the galaxy a pretty populated place, especially if they're landing on different planets and populating them. So it seems like there's lots of life out there, and almost certainly they know we're here. They've probably known we're here since before we even existed. They knew we would be here because our
Yep.
planet's conducive for life. But that maybe we've been speculating about how that would look. I mean, you talk sometimes about first contact, and you say, well, we imagine first contact as either like the ET version, the Contact Carl Sagan version, or like the Independence Day version, but it's probably going to be
Yep.
space trash, right?
Yep.
That's the most likely thing. What that to me seems like maybe we're making another bad assumption that that whatever the ETs are, non-human intelligences are, that they would be something like us. They'd be making trash, and trash would be kind of floating around, and we'd be able to tell what trash was trash and what trash was just space debris or whatever. But it seems to me that there's points of technological development at which you won't even have bodies, or you might be able
Yeah.
to ingrain your intelligence into like fundamental particles or something and just be present everywhere at the same time or something. I know that's wildly
Yep.
speculative, but it's not, doesn't seem totally out of the realm of possibility. And you think that the world, I mean, you've said a few times that you think the world is a weirder place than we give it credit for, and that we're not considering all the good possibilities that might be good explanations for these phenomena. So like what is that space of possibilities? I didn't mean to cut you
Yeah.
off from the Drake thing, but like I'm sure you can find a way to furrow it back in and cover all this.
Yeah. Yes. Um, there's a lot that was sort of packed into that
Yeah,
question.
I'm
So
sorry.
let me sort of, and it's a really good one, and it's a really smart one. So let me try to disentangle a couple of different threads of it. One is, um, you know, Carl Sagan was the biggest 20th century skeptic of UFOs here equal aliens, while also being the biggest proponent of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence
Yeah, they're
everywhere.
probably just having picnics here, right? That was his
Yes.
idea.
Yep. And his argument was never that aliens don't visit Earth. His argument was statistically you would only expect aliens to swing by every 100,000 or 200,000 years. That they would that we look at Earth as the destination, whereas aliens probably treat it more as a rest stop on the Jersey Turnpike. You're somewhere that you sort of stop over on your way from somewhere interesting to somewhere else. And so his argument was never that people beings and aliens don't visit. It's that the thing that you saw out your window last Tuesday is unlikely to be the one time in this 200,000 years that aliens stopped by to check on you. And I think that there's what's useful in that example to me is the way that I think we need to adjust our mindset to sort of galactic scale, and that we just haven't been around for that long. We haven't been looking real hard. Aliens could have swung by the planet 20,000 BC, which galactically would be the equivalent of this morning.
Yeah.
And found nothing interesting here, other than some large megafauna, and some elephants in Africa, and checked off their checklist of let's check back here in another 180,000 years. And that would have been a totally reasonable
Mhm.
decision for them to have made at that moment. And I also think, part of what really scares me is if you take us as a totally normal example of what intelligent life is when it evolves, and again, there's sort of this whole theory in ufology and SETI of sort of Earth you would expect to be mediocre, that like we are not the most advanced planet nor the least advanced planet, but we are probably exactly average. Again, I'm sort of oversimplifying
Oh,
hugely
sure.
complex scientific debates here, but like assume we're average. There's a lot of reasons to look around, here we are in September 2024 and think that the human L is not that big,
Hmm.
that like we may not get another 100 years or another 1,000 years of sort of advancing human civilization and science. Like there's a lot of reasons to like look around on our planet, as someone who's written other books on nuclear war, to think that like, we may not get another 10 years. The climate may not give us, 50. Um and or one of the other challenges in this is you have to be a civilization that not only continues but is interested in exploring the rest of the universe,
Yeah.
which not to get sort of too dystopian or political in the final minutes of our conversation here,
Oh, go for it.
but there's a lot of reasons to sort of think that like maybe misinformation and AI and video games pollutes our culture in the next 20, 30 years, such that like we just won't last as a civilization that is interested in studying outer space. There are a lot of reasons to think that Elon Musk aside, you know we are losing the political appetite to explore the rest of our universe. And that like maybe we'll survive as a civilization for another 1,000 years, but we'll just play video games on our Google Oculus or Facebook Oculus or whatever those things are, and like never bother to look to the heavens for inspiration and exploration again. And like that's the end of L.
That would be the worst, saddest possible outcome. I hope that you're wrong. I think that the one maybe glimmer of hope to me is that it seems like once you hit the ability to like fairly easily destroy your entire planet, you're also on the cusp of being able to get off of it. The technologies have a sort of like convergence there, right?
Yes.
Um, so maybe that extends L, that there's enough, if we are average, maybe there's enough planets where the story is that they did annihilate, but there was just a small enough skin of their teeth that they could get off and start over. But I hope that that doesn't restart the cycle. Garrett, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Where can people find out more about your work? I know that you've got a new book on D-Day that came out this year. Tell us a little bit about that or anything else you want to plug before you go.
Yeah. So I'm at garrettgraff.com online, Vermont GMG. I live in Vermont, so all of my social media handles are Vermont GMG, my initials. Instagram, Twitter, wherever you like to go, threads. And my book is on UFOs or D-Day or 9/11, are available wherever you like to get your books.
We will plug those in the link description. And thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for the great conversation and the amazing questions.
You're welcome. The Anomalous Review is a project of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. It's hosted and produced by me, Michael Glosson, and edited by Kelly Michelle. Our theme song was written and performed by Telma Crisanti. Communication and PR work is by Preston Dykes. Our advisory team includes Jennifer Roach, Robert Powell, Richard Hoffman, Joshua Pearson, and Larry Hancock. To find out more about SCU, check out explorescu.org.